I think I'll turn it over to the official co-host of the event as Jim Kling, a leader in the program team.
Thank you, Alan. Welcome everyone from the Koma Kulshan chapter and beyond. Thanks for joining us today. We've been anxiously awaiting Katrina's presentation, and we're glad we're finally going to get to hear it. We do plan to have a Zoom meeting in May. We're not exactly sure. I don't think we've firmed up the original speaker, but we expect to have somebody. I think that's going to happen. And then we will be thinking about other virtual programs as well over the course of the spring and summer, and we will let people know what we do. And we're very open to suggestions. If anybody wants to suggest possible programs that would be appropriate to be done virtually, please feel free to put those in the Q&A or the chat. So we're going to listen to Katrina Poppe today. She's a longtime member of Native Plant Society, and she's been really active locally as well as doing her own research. And she's a research associate at Western Washington University in the Wetlands Ecology Lab in Huxley. And so with this session, what we're going to do is during the Q&A afterwards, we'll have you raise your hand, use the raise your hand button, and then that will allow you to ask a question through your video. If for some reason you don't have video or audio, or you're unable to figure that out, you can use the Q&A chat function at the bottom of your window to type in your question that way, and then we'll read that off. So with that, I will turn this over to Katrina.
Thanks, Jim. Hi, everyone. Like I said, I'm excited that this talk is finally happening. I've been involved with the Koma Kulshan chapter for several years, and this is the first time I think that I'm giving a talk for this chapter, and so I'm excited about that, and then also excited that it's finally happening after a couple crises for one reason or another. And so I decided that if for some reason this talk doesn't work out tonight, if we have some horrible technical difficulties, I'm not going to reschedule. I'm just going to record me giving a talk to my cats, and I'll send you all the link afterwards. But hopefully we don't have that problem. And speaking of technical difficulties, I am actually going to mute my video, so you're not going to see my face for the bulk of this talk, just to reduce the chances of having any internet bandwidth issues. But my face will come back at the end for the question and answer period. So let's get going. I'll share my screen. And I will stop my video. Okay, so starting the talk on chasing blue carbon on the Arabian Peninsula. Oh. So for this talk, I want to start with an overview of what blue carbon is, and then a little bit on mangrove biology. And then we'll get into our field tour of the United Arab Emirates with some other travelogue type stuff. And the emphasis with this talk is really more on the trip itself than on study results, partly because the travel is the best part, I think, but also because the lab work is still ongoing. So although I have some preliminary results, I don't actually have final results to present yet. So first things first, what is blue carbon? So some of you may have heard this term, but I'm guessing that most of you have not. So blue carbon refers to any carbon that's stored, sequestered, or released from tidal wetlands. So basically any carbon that interacts in any way with these coastal environments. And you might wonder, well, all plants take carbon out of the atmosphere. Don't all vegetated ecosystems do this? So what makes coastal wetlands so special that they get this special term for it? Well, tidal wetlands are especially good at taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and burying it long-term in the sediment. And I'll talk about why that is in the next slide. But this figure here shows the carbon burial rate of a few different types of ecosystems. So coastal wetlands like the seagrasses, mangroves, and salt marshes shown there can sequester carbon much faster, generally like an order of magnitude faster than upland forests, in this case shown as a tropical forest. So what makes tidal wetlands so good at doing this, at sequestering carbon? Well, it's a combination of things. Well, unlike upland systems, wetland soils have less oxygen in the soils because they're wet, so that lowers decomposition rates and keeps the carbon locked up longer. So if you've ever tended to a compost pile, say, you actually want the opposite. You turn the compost to bring more oxygen into it to speed up decomposition, which ends up mineralizing some of that carbon and sending it back into the atmosphere. So don't worry, I'm not judging you for that. I do that with my compost too. But it's just to demonstrate if our goal is to lock up carbon, less oxygen is actually helpful. So what I just mentioned, the anaerobic soil, that applies to all wetlands. There's nothing special about a tidal wetland in that regard. But the other factor that does make tidal wetlands special is the tidal and riverine flooding that brings sediment that buries plants or other organic material, making it less accessible to decomposition. So plants are taking carbon out of the atmosphere when they photosynthesize, and the plants die, and some of that carbon gets locked up in the waterlogged soil and buried under the sediment that's constantly coming in. So that's what blue carbon is. Now, why do we care about it? Well, we know that drained and degraded wetlands release stored carbon into the atmosphere, so they're bad for the climate. And tidal wetland losses continue to outpace gains across the US. We only have a tiny fraction now of the tidal wetlands that we used to have because people love to build cities and farms on them. Yeah, restoration efforts, as some of you know, are limited by lack of funding and resources. So blue carbon has the potential to help by adding this climate mitigation ecosystem service as an additional incentive to prioritize wetland restoration or conservation. So in other words, it's a way to help both reduce climate change and incentivize wetland restoration at the same time. So now I wanted to show you a short film, assuming this works. It's just 5 minutes that does a nice job of describing what blue carbon is and why it's important. So it basically just shows you what I already told you, but in a more entertaining way. And I like this because it was filmed in the Snohomish River estuary, just in Everett. And this was one of the first blue carbon projects I worked on here in the Northwest. So enjoy the film and I'll pick it back up afterwards.
The estuary is, to me, it's a vital part of life. You know, it's kind of like storytelling. The marine water wants to bring in the resources that it has. The fresh water wants to bring down what it's created. And when they mix, it's in that brackish area where things thrive and die and create new life.
So an estuary is a place where the river meets the sea. And they're extremely productive places. And humans know this. If you think about almost any major city, they are built on an estuary. And that's worldwide. The cradle of civilization, the Fertile Crescent, all estuaries. So they're fascinating places to study.
Estuaries provide us with so many benefits. They help improve water quality. They provide key habitat for so many important species that we fish for, that we eat. They also protect our shorelines from storms and flooding. And on top of that, we're now realizing that they're also great carbon sinks.
We call it blue carbon simply because it's carbon that's associated with coastal systems. So it's water. The blue comes from water.
So blue carbon is the carbon that is captured, stored, and released from coastal and marine habitats.
Both forests and wetlands can store carbon, and they're both good at it. But wetlands are better for a couple of reasons. One is that where's that carbon coming from that's in the soils? It's coming mostly from plants that are growing. And wetlands are extremely productive systems. It's a boy. So that's one good thing. Another good thing is there's no oxygen down there in the soils. So that organic matter doesn't decompose very rapidly. So once it's there, it's stored. Another thing is that wetlands just build up soil fairly rapidly as well. In a healthy wetland, you can add a centimeter or so a year, an inch in just 5 years or so. So you can really you're burying a lot of carbon.
So basically, we are realizing that these wetlands are so good at capturing and storing carbon, but we really wanted to know, well, how much carbon is in an estuary and how much carbon is captured through estuary restoration.
So one portion of climate mitigation is keeping the carbon that is in the wetlands there now. And then on the other side of it is restoring wetlands where we can to bring carbon back where it used to be.
Snohomish County in the Snohomish watershed is a really interesting one because there's so many different projects happening within the region. So it's not just this, one restoration site happening within the vacuum. The whole watershed is having restoration done.
Today we're out sampling for juvenile salmonids in the Snohomish estuary. So every salmon that comes up the Snohomish River has to come through this estuary at least twice in its life. And so this habitat is extremely important for them. And as we restore more and more of this estuary, we want to see how those populations, especially how those juveniles, react to that restoration.
You never go into a wetland and just restore one benefit. It benefits the salmon, it benefits the water quality, it benefits the people inland who are now protected from a storm surge. So there's multiple benefits that accrue. You don't even have to think about blue carbon storage. You could be restoring a wetland to restore salmon habitat, and you're going to increase blue carbon.
To me, the big message is that these habitats provide so many benefits. I mean, it's really kind of crazy to think about how many benefits they provide for us. And we're also making a difference in helping to address climate change because these habitats are also capturing that carbon and storing it.
To me, that's the fun part, is when you can sort out how things function and get them to grow, and you watch it grow. That makes you just feel good.
So that was a nice little overview of what blue carbon is. Now let's take this show on the road and do some overseas travel. I thought you might enjoy some virtual travel, especially right now. So we're going to go to the United Arab Emirates, which is in the Middle East. And so we'll see what they're doing with blue carbon over there. So I had the opportunity to work on this project there last September. So here's the United Arab Emirates circled in red there. It's on the horn of the Arabian Peninsula, if you think of it as a rhinoceros head. And the Arabian Gulf is just to the north of it. And the UAE is a very interesting country. It has a population of almost 10 million, and 85% of them are expats. And in terms of size and area, the UAE is about half the size of Washington State. So it's not huge, but there are a couple very large cities, which we'll visit shortly. It's a fairly conservative Muslim country, and they speak Arabic as well as English. You can see from this satellite image that it's quite dry. It doesn't appear to hold any plant life, does it? Most of the plant life there is really hugging the coastline, so that's where we're going to go. So most of the plants along the coastline there are mangroves. And so I wanted to first talk a bit about mangroves because they don't grow here in Washington or in most of the US at all. So you may not know much about them, but they're really cool. So true mangroves can be defined by 5 characteristics. 1, they only occur in the intertidal zone. They're taxonomically isolated from their terrestrial relatives, so they're really adapted to the coastline. The community commonly forms pure stands. So you have these vast mangrove forests that with like just mangroves, like just one species. They have morphological adaptations to the intertidal environment, to periodic flooding. And they also have physiological adaptations to salty environments. So globally, there's 3 main types of tidal wetlands: salt marshes, seagrasses, and tidal forests. And here in the Northwest, we have marshes and seagrasses and some tidal forests, which take the form of Sitka spruce swamps. But as you move closer to the equator and you get warmer, you lose the spruce swamps pretty quickly, and then you eventually lose your salt marshes as well, and those get replaced by mangroves. So mangroves are not very tolerant of freezing temperatures, so that prevents them from expanding their range any further from the equator. But with climate change, as you might imagine, people are starting to observe some range expansion of mangroves, but it'll be a long time before they make it up here, I think. So 52 species worldwide, and the colors on this map here are showing you mangrove species diversity. So places with warmer colors like red show greater diversity. And so you can see the center of diversity worldwide is kind of around Indonesia, where they might have over 40 species there. Whereas in the Americas and in Africa, say only a couple or maybe just a handful of species. So mangroves have to deal with some stressful conditions related to that regular flooding by marine waters. So what do you think the 3 main stressors might be? Well, as I mentioned earlier, there's not much oxygen in their soil, and this is good for carbon storage. It's hard on plants. But they've developed some fancy root structures to help them get more oxygen, and those are called adventitious roots. And I'll show some examples of those on the next slide. Next, living on the coast, they're getting flooded with salty water all the time. So they need ways to deal with this salt, either by excluding it, so keeping it out of the plant entirely, or secreting it, or maybe accumulating it in special cell structures. And then thirdly, living in a salty environment can also lead to sulfide buildup in the soil, which can be toxic to plants. So our seagrasses here have to contend with this as well. Plants can deal with this to some degree by creating sort of a protective oxygen halo around their roots. So that's pretty cool. Now, here are some of those funky types of adventitious roots. So some of them help with gas exchange, like those pneumatophores and knee roots and aerial roots. So they help bring in more oxygen to the plant. And then some of them just help them stay upright in soft substrates like those buttress roots. And some sort of do both, like those stilt or prop roots that have lenticels while also helping to stabilize the plant. So in the Emirates, they have one mangrove species, and it's called Avicennia marina. and it's a really tough species. It can grow in really hot, really salty environments, and here it's sort of near the northern end of its range. And here's why I say they're tough. It gets very hot there in the summer, and even the water averages 90 degrees in the summer. They only get 2 inches of rainfall per year, so they get very little fresh water coming in, very hot, lots of evaporation going on, so the water is extra saline, and it can have up to twice the concentration of salt compared to our oceans here. Okay, so I should give you some background on this project. You might be asking, why United Arab Emirates? Given that the UAE has the highest per capita carbon footprint of any country worldwide, it might be surprising to you to hear that they care about blue carbon at all. But they do, and their environment agency is quite progressive. They've actually been planting mangroves since the 1970s, so they're ahead of us in recognizing the value of their coastal wetlands and those ecosystem services that they provide. And still now they're working hard to protect and expand their mangroves, planting more mangroves, and blue carbon is one way to do that. So at this point, they're really gathering baseline information to determine the value of the carbon in their coastal wetlands, because at some point they realized that just trying to get people to protect wetlands for their own sake was difficult. They were having some trouble with that. But when you can demonstrate that they have some monetary value, you get a lot more people's attention. And now, say what you will about monetizing ecosystems, and I understand that that can be problematic, but sometimes you just have to go with what works. So first here, number one, I said build on a previous study. So a few years ago, they had another study quantify carbon stocks, which is how much carbon is currently stored, how much is currently being held in this ecosystem. But more recently, they wanted to build on that by quantifying the rate of carbon sequestration too, because that's an important part of the story as well. Because you could have a system with high carbon stocks, but very low rates of accumulation, kind of like that tropical forest in that figure I showed you earlier. And conversely, you could also have a system with low stocks, but high rates of carbon burial, which is actually kind of what we tend to see in our estuaries here in the Northwest. So anyway, that's the importance of the rates. So I've been working on a number of projects in the Northwest here to do just this, to quantify the rates of carbon accumulation. And through a mutual colleague, I got enticed to work with them there on this project. So number 2 here says trial to test. So that was really the main goal of this project. There's a commonly used sort of standard methodology for doing this, but it works better in some systems than others for a number of reasons. So this study was sort of a trial to test this methodology in the UAE mangroves to see first if it works at all to give us info that's any good. And then secondly, if it does, it'll give us an idea of what kind of rates we're talking about. And then lastly, another goal was just to provide some training for the folks that work there in the form of workshops and field work, so they could potentially carry this forward in the future if they wanted to. So let's finally get started with the photo tour. So for this study, I spent about 10 days in the country. I had a day or two near the end for sightseeing, but for the most part, I was working all the time. So we had 5 sites, and they were spread across the coast, and pretty much each one in a different emirate. And the emirates are kind of like states here. So we had a different home base every day. And our first site was in Abu Dhabi here. So that was our hotel on the left and our field site on the right. Doesn't get more convenient than that. It's just separated by some very warm water that feels like a bathtub and leaves a film of salt on you. So I guess we were lucky to have bathwater conveniently nearby, because this is very muddy work. So here's me and a colleague, Steve, taking a sediment core. And this was really our goal for this field work, was to get these sediment cores. So I could bring back sediment samples and analyze them in the lab at Western. And we focused on the sediment because that's really where the carbon is getting sequestered in the long term. The plants themselves will store carbon too, but that's really more temporary storage. The plants eventually die and some of it moves into the sediment. And so the sediment, that's really where the carbon is staying for centuries. And so here you might notice that the mud is a totally different color than our Northwest mud, if you're interested in mud at all, like I am. It's almost white here. So this site in particular had a pretty low amount of organic material, but a lot of ground up shell material in the sediment, which made it this white color. Then after getting those cores, we found a, I think, life-saving bit of shade to slice the cores into discs for easier transport. A few of the local scientists came out to help us in the field each day, and they were really into it. They were great. That guy on the right was our boat driver, and I could not for the life of me figure out how he managed to stay so clean. But I think it must be a lifetime of practice wearing that white clothing. Here's my little jerry-rigged contraption to help me slice the mud in 2-centimeter slices. And here's a sample, so you can really see how white that is. Happy field helpers. So it's always a relief when you go to the other side of the globe for work to find that your field methods actually work decently well and you get some samples. Whew. So we did break about 3 shovels along the way, but fortunately they have hardware stores there too. So the next site is Dubai. And Dubai is the largest city in the country, and they're very proud of their shopping malls in their indoor ski area. And there was a ton of new building construction going on here. And this photo was taken early in the morning from my hotel room. This is sort of a recently expanded, sort of newly developed area of the city with new roads that Google Maps hadn't quite figured out yet. But beyond it is a big lagoon where our field site for that day was located. So our site for the day was called the Ras Al Khor Wildlife Sanctuary. And Ras is a common word there, and the word Ras means a headland or a cape in Arabic. And Khor was another sort of common word, and that means a bay or lagoon. So there was a lot of Ras and a lot of Khor. And this wildlife sanctuary housed hundreds of flamingos that we saw when we were there, and lots of other birds too, so it was pretty neat. So here's Steve again there, and our helper for that day, Dr. Mohammed. He works in Dubai, so he knows this area well, and so he showed us around and suggested areas that we might sample. And he was also the only one I ever saw there that wore waders and a dress shirt under his waders. He said he preferred to be able to just take off his waders afterwards and be ready for work. But I don't know if I'd want to go to work with a sweat-soaked dress shirt on. I like this cute little mangrove at the leading edge of the forest. I think it's a great example of the nematophores, those adventitious roots that poke up out of the ground and help the plant breathe. And you can see here pretty clearly how they grow straight up from the roots, which spread out radially from the tree. And you can also just barely see here that this mangrove and its nematophores in particular are helping to trap sediment, as it's created a little mound around the plant, if you can see that. And this is really helpful because we want to be building up sediment regularly. Not so much that you suffocate the plant, but enough to keep up with sea level rise. So this was promising. Now, once we finished coring that day, we had to rush to a meeting at the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment to give them a presentation on what we were doing there and discuss some plans and ideas for mangrove restoration. Fortunately, we had just enough time to take a shower beforehand. When we first got to this building, it's this official looking government building with a staffed gate in front. And we just pulled up and said, we're here to see Dr. Mohammed. And off they let us through. And we chuckled afterwards and thought, we could probably say that anywhere. And it's kind of like saying, open sesame. But the meeting was really fun. And we were hoping that actually Dr. Mohammed was interested in visiting Bellingham sometime to learn more about the methods and collaborate a bit more. So that would be fun. So our third stop is Ras Al Khaimah, another Ras there. And here's another sunrise photo. It always cleared up later in the day, but I think it always looked like this in the morning from all the dust in the air, I think, since it almost never gets rain to clean the air. And here we're trying to figure out how to get into the mangroves in this sort of urban area with this urban stream flowing next to us with questionable cleanliness. And the mangroves here were very dense, and it took us quite a while, probably at least half an hour, just to walk back and forth and find a spot where we could get into it, just get beyond the edge. But we finally managed to get in. And I found the clean sweat towel to be key. Keeps the sweat from getting into your eyes. But it was just a challenge to keep the towel clean. So our last site of that day, fortunately, had cleaner water to wade through. Here's some photo evidence of me just standing around watching other people work. And here's another good picture of all those pneumatophores. And some of them, you can even see little leaf sprouts coming out of them. So that might be another method for mangrove reproduction. And here we were just finished for the day and excited about the clean water. And here you can see there's some mountains in the distance. So we're starting to get into some more mountainous territory. Now on the last field day was on the other side of the country, on the East Coast, and it was next to a different water body, and the water definitely seemed a little bit different, a little bit cleaner and cooler. And this was our favorite site. And you can even see some tiny little baby mangroves in the foreground there. Once again, we had some warm water to cross to get to our mangrove forest.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Just showing a few photos. Here, I think we were just reveling in the completion of our last Khor. And so as soon as we finished our field work and we returned to our parked cars, one of our helpers for the day, another local scientist, pulled out a full-on picnic to feed us breakfast with some fancy cardamom coffee in those tiny little coffee cups and rose tea. And I later learned that this hospitality is kind of a Bedouin custom. A Bedouin are the people that traditionally lived in this area. So she's very generous. And again, mind you, she just got out of the mud and the channel crossing, and somehow her clothes look untouched. I don't know how they do it, but I think it'll just remain a mystery. Here's a picnic spread with pancakes and homemade date syrup and fruit. So now that our fieldwork was done and we successfully secured our 250 sediment samples, we had a couple days to spare, so we went for a drive and we took the scenic route back to Abu Dhabi through the desert. So first we headed south toward the city of Al Ain. And driving through these higher elevation gravel deserts, the geology was really fascinating. So in Al Ain, we visited this oasis. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it demonstrates the ancient called falaj irrigation system that was developed about 3,000 years ago to allow about 100 different varieties of date palms to grow in the desert. As a system that uses both spring water from the mountains and wells and channels the water underground. And archaeologists found this falaj system in Al Ain to be the world's oldest. So here you can see once they bring the water up to the surface, it's channeled along with these outlets that can be opened or closed to water the palms as needed. And here are some dates. And it turned out to be so hot here, about 120 degrees, that we just were speed walking through this site, snapping photos as we went.
120.
There was a nice produce market nearby full of delicious fruits. I realized afterwards I was the only woman there for some reason. And here in the market, various types of dates on display. And dates are one of the few traditional foods actually grown in that country. Most of their other food is imported from elsewhere. And here's a truckload of dates getting transported. So next we headed to this empty looking area called the Empty Quarter, or Rub al Khali in Arabic. And I was really looking forward to seeing some dunes on this road trip. And there's really nothing you can do there except road trip. It's too hot to get out of your car, so there's really no hiking to be done. So road trip it is. This area shares a border with the country of Oman to the east and Saudi Arabia to the south. And you can even kind of see the dunes from this Google Earth satellite photo in the lower left, those little white spots. So this is what the landscape looks like on the ground. There's sort of this underlying flat layer, this gray gravel plain, overtopped with orange sand dunes, and they're this reddish orange color due to the feldspar in them that have iron oxide covered grains. So each one of those big hills is a dune, but then you can also see there's actually little dunes on the big dunes. So there's dunes within dunes. And apparently there's a notably tall sand dune in this area, not the one pictured here, but the tall sand dune in this area that's over 900 feet tall. There were some signs of life here and there, like these huts where camel herders and their camels can rest in the shade. And we saw a few camels there. Here's one. You can see it blends in pretty well with the sand. And I really admired those camels and the camel herders for their ability to live in this heat. So check this out, 48 degrees Celsius is about 118 degrees Fahrenheit. And I could have sworn when I was there that it was hotter than this, but I think I was starting to think that the temperature gauges just stopped at 48. But somehow, apparently, there are other animals that manage to get by in these conditions. Animals like lizards and geckos, foxes, falcons, and there's an Arabian oryx, a kind of ungulate that have their own protected area in this area. Although we didn't get to see any of those animals at this time. More dunes. Now I started realizing it's kind of weird that this talk is for the Native Plant Society and it has no plants in it. So here's one plant. I saw this one species, a shrub, in that entire empty quarter. And I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I cannot for the life of me identify it. And believe me, I tried. But here's a poorly focused close-up, and you can see it has little leaves, kind of the size of your pinky fingernail, and they're quite succulent. Some dunes in the evening glow. That's just a color we don't really have around here. Then back to Abu Dhabi for a day of touristy activities. So I went to the Grand Mosque, which is one of the largest in the world, and it's made with this fancy marble from Italy that is especially white, apparently. And it was just recently, it's not very old, it was just recently the construction was completed. The inside of it has chandeliers that are made to look like upside down palm trees with those three colors of dates, red, orange, and green. And the same colors, red, orange, and green, reflected in the rug. And apparently this is the largest handmade rug in the world. I noticed that they really like their largest, biggest, best, fanciest, whitest things there. And all of these columns on the outside had these inlaid stones that were done by hand. They were quite beautiful. And the mosque in the sunset. So during these last couple days, I was also furiously trying to dry out my soil samples before heading back home. So here I packed in as many as I could into this drying oven. But it turns out the samples I set out on my hotel balcony dried out much better than the ones in the oven. Because it was this temperature, and I don't know how 104 degrees can feel like 136. That seems like a stretch. Maybe the humidity, but I believe it. And when I was working on the samples on my balcony, I had to stick one leg through the door into the air-conditioned room to avoid overheating. So it was quite an ordeal to pack the samples and try to distribute them across multiple bags so that none of them exceeded the airline size and weight limit, and getting them through customs. But to make a long story short, I succeeded in bringing them back to the lab at Western, and I'm still analyzing them there with the gamma spectrometer shown here. And it detects radioisotopes in the samples, which we then use to calculate the sediment accretion rate. So when we combine the sediment accretion rate, basically the rate that the sediment is piling up, the rate that is bearing, we combine that with the amount of carbon in the samples, that gives us a carbon accumulation rate. And that was the whole point of this project. Now, like I said, I only have preliminary results because I'm not done with them yet, and because it takes like a month or so to analyze each core, and I have 10 of them. But here's an example of what we've reported for the first 2 cores. So those 3 figures on the bottom are sediment profiles here. So we're looking at how the sediment characteristics change from the surface, which is at the top of the figure, to the bottom of the core. And so we looked at the density of the sediment on the left, and then also the amount of carbon in the sediment, as well as what's going on with the radioisotopes that I mentioned. And all that tells me that the amount of carbon in the sediment is kind of low, but it's not really that different than what we might find here. But as for the rate, so it looks like the sediment is building up at a decent rate of about 2 to 3 millimeters per year. Now that may not seem like a lot, but really what we want to know is if it's keeping pace with the local rate of sea level rise. And so I would say that it appears that they are, more or less. So the average global rate of sea level rise right now is about 3 millimeters per year, although it's higher in some regions and lower in others. And so we're lucky in our region, in the Northwest here, for example, to have a slightly lower rate, lower than the global average. So when we combine the carbon being stored in the sediment with the rate that it's building up, we get carbon sequestration rates on the right. So the carbon sequestration rates here are lower than the global mean for mangroves. So they're maybe about half of what we might see in tropical mangroves, but they're higher than the other rates that have been reported from other sort of similar arid sites in the Middle East. So since our expectations were low, we were actually pleasantly surprised. So the UAE Environment Agency can then use these values to identify options to incorporate these into policy management to support sustainable ecosystem use if that's what they decide to use, what they decide to do. So that's the end of the show. I want to thank you for sticking with me. And now I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. So you can type them into the Q&A like they said before, if you haven't already. Or maybe raise your hand and maybe Jim or others will help me facilitate the questions. And I know it can take a few seconds sometimes to get this organized, so we might have just a few minutes of awkward silence. And I'll bring my video back on.
Okay, Fred has raised his hand, trying to figure out how to. Okay, so Fred, yeah, okay, go ahead, Fred.
I'm unmuted. Katrina,
Mhm.
wonderful presentation. Thank you very much for that. It's a part of the world that we know nothing about, and it's neat to see this. So I'm amazed that you can pound down these core devices into the sediment there with all these roots and things. What's it like underneath? Are the roots actually decomposing? Or, I mean, how do you get through all that stuff?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. I was really worried about that as well. It's one of the many things I was worried about before getting started with the field work, because especially when it's an environment that you haven't worked in before, yeah, you're worried about stuff coming up like that you might not be able to deal with the methods that you have. But it ended up being that we didn't run into too many huge roots. And so we ran into, there was a lot of those pneumatophores, those little projections coming up out of the ground, but those were actually pretty flexible. And we had sharpened the bottom of our cores, just PVC cores. So, but we had sort of filed them to sharpen them on the bottom. And they just sliced through those pneumatophores really easily. So we didn't have too much trouble. There might have been one spot where we ran into a bigger chunk, maybe a larger root, and you can't cut through that kind of stuff. You just have to start over. So yeah, for the most part, it wasn't too bad. It might be harder in other kinds of mangroves. Yeah.
We have a question from Wendy McClure. She asks if you could repeat what causes the white colored sediments.
It's kind of a combination of a sort of low organic content, but mainly just a lot of shell material. So and you could even see it when you're working with the sediment. A lot of it's just ground to just a powder, and it's just incorporated into the sediment, but there's also just a lot of little pieces of shells that you can see. So just a lot of inorganic carbon in there.
Right. Jason Lucas, I think we have him. Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
You hear me?
Yep. We can hear you.
So blue carbon is produced in plants.
Maybe not so well. If you have trouble, you can go ahead and type it into the Q&A as well. Give Jason another few seconds here. All right, let's try Kim Clarkin's question. She says, how do you get the core out of that muddy sediment?
This is good. These are all easy questions that I can easily answer. I love it. So I guess I showed a lot of pictures of us pounding the cores in, but I didn't show very well how we got them out. But basically, it's very low tech. Since the cores weren't very long, sometimes people take really long cores. And in that case, you need to put a cap on it and rely on suction to pull it out. But in this case, our cores were just half a meter long. They weren't so deep that we couldn't just dig a trench into the mud on one side and kind of lean the cores over, get our hands underneath, and then pull it up from the bottom to make sure none of the mud came out the bottom. And that's partly why we got so muddy, is we had to lie down in the mud and get your hand under there.
I see a question in chat. I would ask everybody to put your questions into the Q&A, please, just to keep them all in one place and make things easier to track. Let's see, so the next question is, Katie Lutz asks, what type of restoration activities are they currently focusing on for estuary wetland habitat in the Middle East?
In the Middle East, yeah. So in the Emirates and other countries in that area as well. Did you say what kind of restoration activities?
Yeah, what kind of restoration activities
they're doing a lot of mangrove planting. There was one area, actually, that, I don't know if you'll remember, but there was a photo I showed early on with, it was a photo of the ocean with a bunch of little, just sort of a line of little mangroves. And that was near Abu Dhabi, and that was a recently planted, just acres and acres and acres. It was huge area of recently planted mangroves, and we even we found it on Google Earth and went over there to check it out because we were wondering what it was, and like, oh, awesome, this giant area of planted mangroves. And we talked to the woman that works with the Environment Agency right there in Abu Dhabi, assuming that she would know something about it, but she didn't. And there's, so I think that was a lot of times it's initiated by the government agencies, but sometimes it's just some company wants to, maybe it's good PR, maybe, I don't know, sometimes it's just part of their private company activities. But there was a lot of replanting going on. And also, like I mentioned, they started planting mangroves in the 1970s, so 50 years ago now. And one of the sites we went to in Abu Dhabi, I never would have known this if someone hadn't mentioned it, but that was actually one of the sort of earlier planted mangrove areas. And I never would have guessed because it looked like a mature mangrove area now, but they've been doing it for so long that, so early on, a lot of the mangroves were wiped out, but then they caught on pretty quickly and started replanting. So there's a lot of activity going on there, yeah.
So Jason Lucas is asking, he's saying, so blue carbon is produced by the plants, and this is good for the environment, which is a question. So I'm not exactly sure what the question is, so maybe just a brief explanation again of what it is and how it's good for the environment, storage of it.
Sure. So it's basically good for the environment in terms of, yeah, so the blue carbon part of it is good for the environment in the way that it's good for climate change. So when the plants photosynthesize, they take carbon out of the atmosphere, it's incorporated into the plant tissue, and some of that, as the plant dies, some of that might get decomposed or it will float elsewhere, but some of it will get stored in the sediment. Like I said, it'll go into the roots, or the plant itself will get buried. And so that's how the plants are a big part of the sort of blue carbon process. And so that's carbon that's come out of the atmosphere and stays in the sediment for potentially centuries. And so other sort of non-wetlands, like just our upland forests around here, they also, those giant trees, they take a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. But when that tree dies, it doesn't necessarily get buried in the soil and locked up there forever. There's more oxygen in the soil, so it decomposes, and eventually that carbon is re-emitted to the atmosphere. So that's a situation where it's just more temporarily locked up. And then, I guess I didn't mention this that much, but the film I showed touched on this, that blue carbon is one big benefit of having these coastal wetlands, but aside from, like, the carbon is just one ecosystem service that they provide, and they're so valuable for so many other reasons, like providing habitat for wildlife, fish, and filtering our water. And one big one as well is sort of protecting the coast from storms, storm surges. Yeah, so there's many reasons that I know that they are working on protecting and restoring these systems, and the carbon is kind of like a new, kind of a trendy one that we've sort of caught on to recently, and we're quantifying it because some people get excited about that. Could potentially enter them into carbon offset markets to get some money for it. But really, it's just one of a long list of ecosystem services. That was a long answer.
An important one. Chuck Nassiger wants to know if the vegetation looked healthy. I'm guessing he's maybe talking about the restoration, maybe even recent restoration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were many areas where the vegetation looked really healthy, but there were also areas where it didn't look so healthy. And we actually, I didn't mention this, but we kind of designed our sampling sites to, at each site, we'd try, if we had the opportunity, we'd take a core from a healthy site, and then we'd take another core from a less healthy looking site, to see if we saw any differences in the data there. And sometimes the areas that were unhealthy, maybe they weren't getting drained very well, maybe the hydrology had been altered, something like that. Or sometimes we just couldn't quite figure out why they looked so unhealthy. So it's still an open question.
Vicky Jackson's asking, are there other species of plants in the mangrove community?
I didn't see any other species in the mangrove communities, so they really were like truly sort of pure stands. But in some areas, they also have salt marshes there, and so sometimes there would be little patches of salt marshes right next to the mangrove patches. And shoot, and I'm not going to remember the name of but there's one species that's very dominant in the salt marshes there. I'm not going to remember the name of it, but it kind of looked to me like a giant, like a larger pickleweed shrub. Everything there has kind of the succulent quality, as you might imagine. Yeah. So those, but other than that, yeah, for the most part, it was the coastline. Any plants along the coast, it was like 90 or 95% mangrove.
All right. Shelley Benson, how much carbon does freshwater wetlands store compared to saltwater wetlands? What about grasslands? She heard that they also can be great for storing carbon.
What was the last part of that?
That she said, what about grasslands? I heard they are great too for storing carbon. Yes,
those have been getting a little bit of press recently. So freshwater wetlands, they can store, like if they're not connected to the tide, say, if that's what the question is, they can store, they can have a fair bit of carbon stored, so their carbon stock might be pretty high, but they usually just don't have, they're not accumulating it very quickly because the water they're getting usually doesn't have as much sediment in it. There's not as much sediment as would be coming from the ocean or from a large river. But there are also tidal freshwater wetlands that are being stored for, or being studied, and for blue carbon. And those can tend to have a lot of carbon and pretty high rates of carbon accumulation. So the only piece is, or the only question then, when you have freshwater wetlands, there's a good chance that they're also emitting methane as well. And so generally, the saltier the environment, the less methane they're going to be emitting. So that's one benefit of being in a really salty environment is, like in the UAE, we're pretty darn confident that we don't have to worry about methane being emitted. That would be sort of like subtracted from the carbon that's being sequestered in terms of like carbon credits that they could be getting. So yeah, so in fresh systems, you have to worry about the methane that in some cases can basically subtract out any gains that you get from sequestration. So it can be significant.
And what about grasslands? How do they?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I can't recall any hard numbers offhand, but grasslands can store a lot of carbon, and they probably accumulate it at a decent rate too, just because the plants grow so quickly, and turn over a lot. But they're not wetlands, and so there's more oxygen in the soil. So a lot of that, again, it's going to be kind of a more temporary carbon storage, where it's locked up there. There's probably a fair bit in the surface of the soil, but it's not necessarily going to be staying there for centuries.
Right.
Still has benefits, but it's, not as permanent.
Fritz Ulrich wants to know, is carbon storage dependent on the temperature? Could more carbon storage, hot, less storage, or the other way around? So is there more storage in cold weather or hot weather?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another kind of a equation that you have to weigh out, where the temperature affects the productivity of the plants. So that might be beneficial, but it also affects decomposition. So in a warmer system, you might have more decomposition as well. So that's an area where there's a lot of ongoing study right now, and a lot of people are studying what's the effect of climate change on carbon storage, productivity, plant biomass, decomposition, stuff like that. And some studies will show, sometimes different studies will have conflicting conclusions. And so it's still kind of a very active area of research.
All right, Janka Hobbs asks, do you plan to check the unhealthy sites for pollutants?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that is one area where the local scientists there were interested in looking into. I didn't do that, and it wasn't really part of the scope of this project necessarily, but yeah, that's a really good question.
Ernest Thompson is asking, do you get the feeling that the locals were doing restoration for carbon credit political points, or that they really cared about the environment aesthetically?
So, well, the folks that are doing the restoration are, at least the ones I interacted with, are the folks that work in the environment agencies in the local municipalities. And so they, tend to be pretty progressive, and they're also interested in, it seemed like they're also genuinely interested in the health of the systems, and recognize that they help protect their coastline and help clean the water and stuff like that. But for sure, like, the reason this has gotten so much interest, this blue carbon stuff, these days, not just there, but elsewhere, is that it can potentially, like I said, just bring in some more funding opportunities. But a lot of people, even if not for the funding itself, a lot of people are just interested in supporting restoration that has a climate change component. There's actually a lot of companies that are interested in supporting that kind of stuff as well. It's just good PR. So yeah, I guess it's all interconnected, who's doing what, but the more interest you can get from different parties, the more successful you'll be.
Great. And Eric Gordon is asking, how does carbon in calcium carbonate compare with organic carbon in these soils? Do estuaries have any special role to it compared to other shore areas?
I'm not sure that I understood the second half of that question. Do estuaries have any specific role?
Yeah, with respect to calcium carbonate, I guess.
So usually when we're doing blue carbon studies like this, we are just, it's a part of like standard reporting protocol. We're supposed to just report organic carbon. And so I actually measure both organic and inorganic. So I have that information, but usually people they don't want you to count the inorganic carbon as part of what you're counting towards potentially getting carbon credits for. And I think that's because it could be, because it probably didn't come from the plants. And the whole chemistry of it and how it's stored and what happens to it in the system is different too. But yeah, and I don't know as much as I should about just like the second part of that question, what role do the estuaries there play with the calcium carbonate, the inorganic carbon? But it's interesting because clearly it's a big part of the system there.
Yeah.
So yeah, good question.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. Give it another minute. Anybody else have any questions? Please type it in or raise your hand. I don't see anything. All right. So I guess what we'll do then is move to the local part of the meeting. Thank you everyone for joining us, both local members of the chapter and people who are not local but decided to join us as well. You're actually welcome to join us as well if you like too. I see no reason why anybody couldn't join us if they want. I think the plan then is to bring attendees who want to sort of video chat in a group on as panelists, and that will allow us, all the panelists will be able to talk. Denise, is that right? Is that what we're going to do?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So attendees, I guess if you want to join, why don't you raise your hand and we'll add you as panelists, and then we'll get going with the rest of the talk. Again, thanks so much for everyone for coming.
Thanks for
Thank you,
joining.
everyone. Thank you, Katrina.
Yes, nice to sort of see everyone or know that you're staring at your screen at the same time. Okay, so mute.
See, Abe has joined us.
Yes, hi Abe.
Abe.
You came from far away, lurking in the background.
Yeah. I went out to Lummi Island a few days ago, and there are some balds near Reed Harbor, and I enjoyed tromping around out there. Saw some death camas blooming, some wildcat clover. It wasn't blooming yet, but the Trifolium vildanovii, and some other bald plants. It reminded me a lot of the balds above Larrabee State Park, kind of on Cleator Road and above Highline. There was some camas, but the camas wasn't blooming there yet.
Good.
I think it might be a spot to look for northernmost records for Whatcom or for plants in Washington State. Because Whatcom County doesn't have a lot of this kind of habitat. Oh, I found evergreen huckleberry, and as far as I know, it's the only native record, like a non-planted evergreen huckleberry growing.
Oh yeah, I've never seen it in Whatcom County. Great. But it's so close. Like, well, I've never seen it closer than Whidbey Island or Deception Pass. Yeah.
So that's my phenology update.
Hi, Amy. Hi, Annalise.
Hi.
Hi, Annie and Bob.
That's nice to see your faces.
Yeah, you guys do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Katrina. That was awesome to finally hear you talk.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Katrina. That was fun.
There's a lot of other folks that are not showing their faces.
That's because they're still in their pajamas.
Right. It's a slow day. Yeah.
I'm gonna go ahead and unmute. So I see Barry's muted. I mean, unless he wants to be, I guess. Byron, Pam, Barry, you guys are all muted, so you should be able to mute.
Vicky is too. Here's Vicky.
There's Vicky. All right.
Hi, Vicky.
Hi.
Are you in the Northwest?
I am in the Northwest. I'm tucked in my boat right now.
Boat. Good.
Yeah. I was down on, I went to Washington Pass today, and the flowers are coming on really nicely there.
Good.
You were down there, right?
Washington Park or Washington Pass?
Sorry, Washington Park.
Okay.
Anacortes.
Sure.
Nice.
So what's up with Amy?
Not a whole lot. We're staying at home quite a lot. So we live by a lot of inner urban trails, but a lot of them, the couple times that we've gone on walks, have been pretty crowded. So we're trying to be extra safe with the social distancing. And I'm thinking about heading down Baker here pretty soon, though, just to see where the snow line is. I don't know. Has anybody been up there at all? Like down that area? No.
Jim Davis was heading up, but I don't see. He was signed up for the webinar. I don't see him right now.
Oh, okay.
I was up on Sumas last weekend at about it was about 3,000 feet around Lost Lake. And there was snow there in patches, but it was certainly not covering it completely.
Okay. That's good to know. My car can't make it too far in the snow, so.
Yeah, the road was clear all the way up there, so
Okay.
there was no issue at all.
That's good to know.
And no people other than people in the gravel pit shooting.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you have to go a little ways to get out of the way of people nowadays.
Yeah, it's hard.
Don't go on the east side of Stewart Mountain. They've closed that off. I got booted off.
Oh, okay. What's going on there?
To private timberland, and
great.
it had been permit accessible, and they closed. They just told everybody with permits so they can't be on there. I hadn't heard, and Fish and Wildlife agent was up there and sent me down the hill.
Gotcha.
I was going down anyway. But.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Hi, Annalise.
Hi. This was so great. I mean, I wish I could see you guys in person, but I was out gardening while listening to Katrina. I was like, this is such a strange world where I can listen to Katrina and look at her pictures and garden at the same time. So weird.
Very good.
I snuck into Deception Pass State Park today, and
for educational purposes.
Yeah, I had to film
I was
a
going to say,
virtual.
how did you get into the park?
Well, it was sneaky. Anyway, I'm filming these virtual field trips for my classes, and that's a great place. But anyway, in sneaking through, I was amazed at some of the old growth Douglas firs that are in parts of Deception Pass